I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
I wanted to start out, Lee, with a trivia question. How many Chinese writers have won the Nobel Prize for Literature?
Well, that depends on how you define who is Chinese.
Now, you're supposed to give me a reductive answer. That way I can cut you down and insert a joke of some kind. That's the dynamic, Lee.
What is China?
See, now you're asking good questions, and what you're supposed to do is play the foil. I'm the smart one, and you're supposed to have something, you know.
I know you always say that's the case, and I never quite fit into that mold.
I know. We never did fully agree on it. Anyway, but the reason I asked the question is because...
So Mo Yan is the first citizen of the People's Republic of China, and the only citizen so far to win a Nobel Prize for Literature.
Right. The reason I asked the question the way I did is because if you ask the question, how many Chinese people have won it, you know, like you were trying to get at before I cut you off, it gets kind of broad, right? Because technically there are two. If by Chinese we mean someone who writes in Chinese about people in China and specific areas in China. And in that case, the first winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature was in 2000, and that was Gao Xingjian. We're going to be talking today about his kind of breakout piece, Bus Stop, Chejian.
So we're talking about the first ethnically Chinese person to win a Nobel Prize for Literature.
Yeah, and it was always interesting introducing this person occasionally in my classes when I would ask them the same question I asked you and then say, well, he won the Nobel Prize. Well, they would go, oh, well, he's not Chinese then. And I would say, well, why? Well, because he won the Nobel Prize. And say, what does that have to do with anything? Well, because there's no one's ever won the Nobel Prize for Literature who's Chinese. There was this weird sort of flip-flop logic happening. But that's also because until, it may still be the case, I need to check this, but for a long time, everything he wrote was banned in China. Like you could not get it in the mainland.
But we should point out, he was writing in the Chinese language, correct?
Oh, yeah, and still is. I mean...
he's written some things in French.
Yeah, he relocated to France in the late 80s in a little suburb outside of Paris.
So this is before Tiananmen.
This was before Tiananmen, and of course, when he wrote after Tiananmen, that's what got him banned all over the minute. But even before then, his plays weren't allowed to be performed in Beijing.
He's a fairly political writer.
He's fairly political, but in a very oblique,
in the same way that Beckett is a political writer.
Exactly. And it's a good reference because Gao is heavily influenced by Beckett. And
we should actually point out he's a translator of Beckett and also of
Ionescu.
Ionescu, the Romanian writer.
Yeah.
Beckett and Ionescu are both very famous, I would say the most famous absurdist playwrights in the 20th century. Beckett being Irish,
but he
French.
wrote entirely in French.
Well, he wrote both. He wrote Waiting for Godot, I believe, in both French and
I want to say, well, it was at the very least it was French first, but for quite a period of time he only wrote in French.
He worked in the Resistance. Ionescu is also an absurdist writer. I've never really liked either of them, but Gao Xingjian is the translator to Chinese for these writers.
Yeah, so he's working in Chinese. He's for Chinese people. And his novels and plays are about China. So the question of ethnicity and whatnot is an interesting one because he's a French citizen now, officially. In the late 90s, he was granted French citizenship. But even now, his works are either entirely or mostly in Chinese.
Rob, I have to ask you, you're one of the great scholars on the French-Chinese connection.
Agreed. Perhaps the greatest.
The greatest scholar on the French-Chinese connection.
Currently living. There may have been others before me.
In the English-speaking world.
Yes, okay, fair enough.
Have you read any of his works in French?
No, I have not.
Okay.
That doesn't disqualify me, though, because I do a lot of other things.
But I was wondering how his French measures up.
That's a good question. I need to go to read some of them. But by all accounts, I mean, from what I've read, in the press, supposedly, he's very, very good. Because I know he speaks... I think he already spoke French before he even began getting interested in France, because he studied foreign languages in college. But we should jump into the actual piece, Bus Stop, Chejian.
Yeah, can you give us a summary of this?
Well, it's funny because summarizing it is a little... Okay, it's about people at a bus stop. That's it. I mean, and it sounds so reductive, but that kind of is what it is. Just like
Waiting for Godot
by Samuel Beckett is two guys waiting for a guy named Godot, and that's the whole piece. In this case, they are very, very similar pieces. You have people at a bus stop in Beijing who are waiting for a bus, and a bus does come and go, And this happens a few times, but it never stops.
It almost seemed like a translation of Waiting for Godot.
It is in places, yeah.
And I want to just say translation in the broadest sense of the word, in that it's translating it not only across languages, but also across space and time, and into a totally separate context. But it feels really similar.
The flow and the pace is very similar.
There's not really any point, and that is the point.
Yeah. They are, in a way, it's a very realistic depiction of waiting at a bus stop, because people are just sort of, their conversations are all unguided and random. They'll be pursuing a theme and then they'll drop it, or it'll just become nothing. And in any given series of conversations, there's nothing to connect them inherently. Like, you can't read it and go, oh, I see where this is going. That doesn't happen.
Because it doesn't go anywhere.
It doesn't go anywhere. Just like Samuel Beckett.
Just like standing at a bus stop.
Yeah, exactly. And in this case, it's interesting, though, because Waiting for Godot is set like in the middle of the countryside or something. Like, it doesn't have any particular setting, you know?
And it's also set during the Nazi occupation. It's almost a sense of French resistance. That's my understanding.
And you can read that in there, but in terms of what's there, what you're watching, who knows? It could be anywhere. It could be France. It could be the moon. I don't know. Whatever. This is Gao Xingjian's piece is in Beijing. You have certain accent markers like the R, the Erhua. That's sort of a northern affectation.
Just for those who don't know. So if you wanted to say something in standard Chinese like, I don't know where the zoo is, it would be 我不知道动物园在哪里. But in Beijing Hua, that is the Beijing accent, you would say something like 我不知道动物园在哪儿.
Right.
So
Lots of heavy
Erhua.
R's. That's the way I learned to speak Chinese. That's still kind of the way I speak it.
Ooh,
I know.
that's not good.
Well, depends where you are. Anyway, but the point is that there are these accent markers. Not only did the play directions say we're in Beijing, but even if it didn't say that, if you were in the audience, as soon as one of these characters speaks, you're like, oh, they're in Beijing. Or at least Beijing, Tianjin, something like that.
Beijing,
yeah. A, they're in a specific location. B, they are all... They're not given names, whereas Beckett's Waiting for Godot, they are. You have Vladimir and Estragon. In Gao Xingjian's, they're all types. So you have an old grandpa, you have a young, kind of a punk kid, you've got a guy reading a book. They're basically just social types, and they're all waiting at a bus stop. What they talk about is just kind of general nothingness in life, and a bus never comes to get them. I mean, it comes and goes, and that's all.
Much like bus stops in Beijing.
Yeah, much like real-life bus stops in Beijing. And so in that sense, it's a much more direct commentary than something Samuel Beckett would have written.
You mean direct and kind of like contextualizing it on Beijing and China and things like that?
Well, they're waiting for not just... They're not waiting for a person to come. They're waiting for a modern technological thing that's going to take them to wherever they need to go. And it never does. And so this is one of the things cited, I think, by authorities in the early 80s that meant this thing was banned, was you have citizens who are, by all accounts, decent people in this play, but they're being totally ignored and left where they are to rot.
Is that the message? It's a governmental message? It's about government?
I don't know if it's a governmental message, because you can't say, well, the bus equals the government, you know. But authorities certainly read it as these people believe they're being abandoned to just stand around and do nothing, you know. Whereas the whole message that the Deng Xiaoping era, which is the late 70s, early 80s, was supposed to get across was things are changing, things are getting better, things are improving, things are opening up and all that. And here's a play about people basically waiting the way people have waited in China for many, many generations, and nothing ever comes. Again.
I almost read it as a sort of existentialist message.
Well, you can certainly read it that way, too.
I guess there are so many different ways you can read it. That's one of the...
Just as Beckett, yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the beauties of Beckett and UNESCO and Gao Xingjian, is that it's so sparse in terms of message.
Yeah.
Not in terms of content,
mm-hmm.
but in trying to guide you. We read a couple of other writers like this who were also in the 80s. Tan Shui's Hut on a Mountain.
Yeah.
It seems a lot like this, although she's drawing more off a Kafkaesque rather than a Beckett-esque. Han Xiaogong, also writing, one of the Shungun writers in the 1980s, who was writing. He wrote Ba Ba Ba, a story that has absolutely no plot, both of which we've done podcasts on.
What's interesting about those, though, is that they're sort of overtly weird in a way this one isn't. This one's just...
It's quotidian.
That's a good word for it. Yeah, it's an everyday scene that never ends. It's imagine like an episode of Seinfeld, but one that went on for like 1,000 years,
and much less funny.
Yes. But there's nothing that happens to them that's, no fairies descend. There's no like giant gourd-headed child that rolls onto the scene like in
Ba Ba Ba.
Yeah, exactly.
That was just a crazy story.
It was a pretty crazy story. But something like that wouldn't even happen here.
Yeah.
The whole point of it is...
It's just about daily life, which is why I took it as an
you can do it. Say the word. Use your words.
Existential piece.
Yes. And in that sense, it's actually probably closer in spirit to something like Sartre, like No Exit, where it's just... The whole point of it is that there isn't any way out. The bus isn't going to take him anywhere in Gao Xingjian's piece. Where would they walk to? The same question. It's why leave from this bus stop? What is there besides this bus stop? And the answer is no. It's the same thing anywhere they go. Even if the bus were to take them away, it would take them to another place just like the bus stop. And in that sense, that sort of guides your reading of their conversations, because what is there to talk about?
Is there any point in them locating in Beijing? Because what's so interesting about what you just said is I find so many cities in China to be like that, where you can just walk and it's all the same thing. It's like walking through suburbia America. But Beijing is different.
Yeah. Well, when I was saying the same thing, I wasn't necessarily meaning like landscape-wise, although that's certainly true in some places. I was thinking more just they could go home, but then they're going to have to go right back to either work or their sort of quotidian lives. There's no thing to do. That's, they're not being taken on some grand adventure. And so it's also why they're not talking about anything, because their lives don't have really adventure. They're just waiting for a bus. That's who they are at this point.
And that won a Nobel Prize.
Well, I don't know if this won a Nobel Prize.
But, I mean, from what I've read of his other pieces, they're
very similar. I think one of the novels that cemented the Nobel Prize for him was a novel he wrote called Soul Mountain, Lingshan. That is, I think, an absolutely fascinating piece of narrative, because you have a single character who's on a sort of a journey through Sichuan and in various places along the Yangtze River, but there's multiple narrative voices applied to that person. There's he, there's she. If I remember correctly, there's you a couple of places, but it's all applying to the same character. It's a much more adventurous novel. A lot more happens in that one, sometimes even in a magical realist way.
In other words, something happens in
Something happens. Nothing happens in Bus Stop. And, the reason we're talking about Bus Stop is A, because
that was what launched him.
That's what launched him. And B, it's interesting to me that it gets banned because
there's nothing in it.
Exactly.
How can you ban something that has nothing happens
in it? But I think that was the whole... This is why I think it's such an interesting test case, because for the communist authorities in the early 80s, that was a bad message to send to people. That, no, actually, daily life is the way daily life has always been. There's nothing revolutionary or cool about the new era that we're in. Okay, maybe there's less censorship, but who freaking cares? You're still going to wait for the bus for 1,000,000 years.
And they censored that.
Yeah, because, you don't want people to read, oh, maybe daily life is meaningless. You want them to see, no, things are changing. That's exciting.
Have to have meaning. Even in the Deng Xiaoping era, things have to have meaning. Less so than in the Maoist era.
Yeah.
But
it's, even then it was, you can see a piece like this bombing in Maoist China, too, because, imagine saying like, oh, you think things are changing? Yeah, they're not. You're still poor and you're still hungry, and that hasn't changed.
To be fair, in Maoist China, you would have just been shot.
Yeah, that's true. They would have taken a less direct approach. Gao into the fleeing got away with it, but you probably would have been, lynched for it in Maoist China.
And I don't think his life in China was horrible.
I think one of the main reasons he ended up fleeing was A, he saw which way the tide was turning, and B, they wouldn't let him perform anything. None of his plays were allowed to be performed or even given out to other groups to do in smaller theaters, like nothing. And so I think at some point he just kind of went, okay, well, if I can't literally do anything here, I guess I might as well try it somewhere else. And then that's why he went to France. I think one of my closing thoughts would be sometimes being political in the context of Chinese literature means something a little different. Because, like you say, this doesn't scan as immediately revolutionary or rebellious.
But in a place like China...
In a place like China in the early 80s specifically...
Which is coming out of an absolutist kind of state, and it's moving to a much freer state, but it still has that kind of lingering authoritarianism of the Maoist era. Everything is political.
Everything is political, yeah.
And we know that eventually... The 1980s is going to end. The 1990s comes around, 2000s. Things are relatively free, but now in the Xi Jinping era, things are moving...
They're locking back down again.
Locking back down, yeah. There are lots of kind of gestures towards Maoism.
And just so, this is why the play is such an interesting piece, because the central idea is that daily life is kind of a universal. The daily grind of just waiting around doesn't change. That no matter where you are, no matter what regime you're under, life is drudgery in this piece. So in that sense, it's highly revolutionary, but definitely not the way you would imagine.
It's revolutionary, not revolutionary.
Right, not the revolutionary with the capital R. You can find it in English. I know they've got translations of it out there, so you can check it out if you want.
I was going to ask you, Rob.
Yo.
As we're here waiting for the bus.
Yes.
At the bus stop.
Yeah.
What's going on?
What now?
Are we doing anything?
We're not doing anything.
Oh, I think I see the bus coming, so it's time to end the podcast.
And this is especially existential because we're in a sound booth. So if Lee is seeing a bus, we're right back into Beckett territory.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.